Cool. Morning, everybody. Hope everyone's doing. We're missing. Where's our front row? What happened? Like, there's like only half of you guys that are here. We'll represent in the front row. You guys got to stand strong today. Half of your colleagues are not here. We are continuing today in our exploration of the human skull, and I actually really like this image that I'm starting off with here, and particularly because all of the bones, not all, well, there's some things I like about this. What I do like about it is that you can see all of the bones separating from a single bone in the middle of the skull. I haven't talked about this. Anyone know what this bone is that all the other bones are being removed from? Sphenoid bone. Yes, we're going to cover this today. It's often referred to as the keystone bone of the cranium because almost all of the other bones articulate with it. So we're going to talk about that bone. And also this guy that's kind of moving up, kind of looks like a walnut right there. That's your ethmoid bone. We're going to cover that guy today too. Those are the last two bones of the cranium, and then we'll move in and talk about the facial bones. But first, I got your lab practical results back for you. So I'm going to share the overall class average, and then after class I will open up your grades. We'll continue the skull. I've got a drawing activity because class wouldn't be complete if you didn't get to draw some skull bones. And then just some reminders and a ticket out. This will be our last lecture until after spring break. So I want to send you off with a good, it's not Friday, but I have a Venn diagram for you today. So lab practical results, grades, I'll open them up in Blackboard immediately after class. You can see the distribution here. The mean was a 77. So that's about normal. That's actually a little bit higher than what I often see historically in lab practicals for like 251 anatomy and physiology or this course. You can see where you fell here. Again, this is a histogram showing grades on the x-axis here and the number of people getting each grade on the y-axis. So 6 of you got between 90 and 100, 10 of you got between 80 and 90, and so on. So no surprise, average here is overall less than it is on other exams and assessments we've had in class, as I predicted, largely because it's not open book, I think. Also, the labs are challenging. There's a lot of stuff to memorize. Overall, I think the class did really well. You can see where you stand individually when I open the grades. I know that the lab practical, the way it's set up, it's a little hard to go back and see what you got wrong because there's no like paper documentation. I did leave all of the lab specimens, or the specimens we use for the practical, except for the cat, kind of organized with their stations. After break, during open hours or during lab time, I'd be happy to kind of debrief with you and go over what you got right or wrong, so we'll have that information. So I don't have like a sheet to hand back to you with what you got right or wrong, but if you want to know that, I could definitely provide it and we can go over it and you can see it without knowing like what the station was and what you're looking at. It's a little bit out of context anyway, but everything I'll leave out in the lab. So there's your lab practical. For the questions on insertion and origin, I had said explicitly that I would ask you to know the bone, and for a couple of the questions, so the option was coxal bone ischium, coxal bone ilium. I gave you full credit if you picked either of those answers because I had said if you just need to know the bone. And so technically those are two parts of the bone. So if you picked for any of the insertion origin questions, if the answer was coxal bone, if you picked either of those, you got full credit. And I'll open the grades after class. And I will also then add in your recent activity grades and all your lab grades and everything like that. It'll be updated in Blackboard, as well as your midterm letter grade as well. And those are, instructors post those on Friday this week. So the grade you see in Blackboard will be your midterm grade. So if that grade is not to your liking, now's the time to make it work. Plenty of time left in the semester to get any grades up as you like. If you're really happy with your grade, well, you can just sit back and relax for the rest of the semester. No, just kidding. You got to keep working hard to keep that grade up. So, questions on any of that?
How many points were the questions each?
In the lab practical, they were 2.5 points each. And you did, I want to clarify one other thing. If you, for the histology questions, if you identified the wrong tissue, let's say that the right answer was cuboidal epithelial cells, and you put simple squamous epithelial cells. But then in the place in the body, you put esophagus, which is correct for squamous epithelial cells, you got partial credit for that. So you didn't get like, if you got the cell type wrong, the tissue type wrong, you didn't lose, you could still potentially get partial credit for knowing where the tissue that you named is located, even if it's not the proper tissue inside. So there's a few questions where you got partial credit. Yep. Cool. All right, well, let's talk about the skull. So this is a diagram from yesterday, actually. The only reason I have this up here, remember, you've got a study guide available. This will take you through the major bones. It has the diagrams I'm including in lectures. Many of them are without labels, but you can go ahead and add that. So most of you probably got this on Monday. Just as a reminder, you can scan that and use that as a reference. Now, our last class, we talked about the 8 bones of the cranium. Just a little quick refresher here. You should know all of these bones on the diagram, as well as some other features that you see down here. Remember, there's 8 bones of the cranium, 2 of which are paired. So we have 2 temporal bones, left and right, this guy here, 2 parietal bones, left and right, which is this guy here. We then have the occipital bone, which is the inferior and posterior region here. We have the frontal bone, which is the anterior region, kind of going up right to the top of the head and this coronal suture here. And then we have a couple other bones we haven't talked about in detail yet. We have the sphenoid bone, you see right here. And then you have the ethmoid bone, which from this angle, you can just kind of see it right here in the orbit of the eye, but most of it is obfuscated by these other bones. So we'll take a look at that in a second. Now, the sphenoid bone that you see here, don't be fooled by the way it looks from this angle, because it's a really funky looking bone. In my opinion, I forget who asked me a couple weeks ago or last week what my favorite bone in the body is. I don't know the favorite, but this one is definitely the most whack-a-madoodle. This is the sphenoid bone. This is what it looks like. So you can see when you're looking at it from here, from the side, this is the lateral view. Part of it is visible here just anterior to the temporal bone, right? But if you look at it, if you take all the other bones away, look at it, this is looking at it from the rear of your head back. This is a posterior view. And you can see that it's got this body, which is this part in the middle. Remember, for example, you saw the term body applied to the main kind of thicker part of your vertebrae as well. So that's the body of the sphenoid bone. And then it has these paired processes coming off. We have anteriorly here, we have the lesser wing, and we have the greater wing on either side here, and then we have the pterygoid process kind of coming down here. So it's this really weird shaped bone. I'm going to show you from a different angle as well, because it looks quite different from each angle. One other aspect you should know about this is it actually forms the orbital fissure. So if you look through here, you're looking into the orbit of the eye. So that this opening right here between the lesser wing and the greater wing is the superior orbital fissure. And that will make more sense when we look at it from an anterior view in just a second here. But I want to orient you to that. Yeah, please.
Is this considered a irregular bone?
This is considered, and is it considered a flat bone because of its origin development? It's going to be considered an irregular bone. Yep, I'm going to go with that. It has some aspects of a flat bone in that it has the diploe is like the sponge, what we call the spongy bone in this kind of bone, but its shape is clearly about as irregular as you can get. So let's take a look at this guy in context. So if we cut the skull off in a transverse section, look down on it. So this is the superior view. Remember, this is the front of this will be the front of the skull. This will be the posterior. This big hole right here, what's this guy called? Foramen magnum. Good, big hole. That's where your spinal cord comes up and meets your brain. And you've got that is in the occipital bone. Your sphenoid bone sits right here. So now you see what it looks like in pinkish purple there from a superior point of view. You can see the lesser wing here, and then you can see the greater wing down here. Now notice that the lesser wings kind of form this part of the anterior cranial fossa. There's this big flat surface here between the 2 lesser wings. I'm gonna go back a slide for a second. Just note that when you look at it from this angle, this looks like 2 little pointy things pointing off, right? But they're not. They actually are continuous, and they continue anteriorly and form this kind of big surface right here. So just note that we need to look at this bone from all angles. We have plenty of examples of this in lab. You'll see what they look like. A couple other features that are important here is actually the other feature I want to point out is there's this thing right here. It's a little hard to see from this angle, but that is something called the sella turcica or the hypophyseal fossa. And so it's this flat area. Actually, I should rephrase that. The hypophyseal fossa is this flat area. The sella turcica is kind of this curved thing around it. You can't really see it from this angle. I'll show you it from another angle in just a second. It's this little, essentially like a cylindrical cup. And in this sits your pituitary gland, also known as the hypophysis. And so it's called the hypophyseal fossa because your hypophysis, your pituitary gland, sits in there. Now, the pituitary gland probably doesn't mean that much to you just yet. Later, after spring break, we get into the brain and the anatomy of the brain. We'll come back to this. But this sella turcica is where it sits. And if we look at it in a cross section here, you can see the sella turcica is this guy right here. It's this little kind of like, almost like a cup, and in which sits your pituitary gland. So that's an important feature of your sphenoid bone. You can also see that you have a sinus in your sphenoid bone again. So as we cut away the bone, you can see the bone is continuous all around this. It's an air pocket in the middle of the bone, which you can't really see when you have just the bone because it's completely surrounded by bone. The sphenoid bone also has some key pairs of openings. I want to show you these. We don't need to memorize these right now. I know I have these in red, but we'll get to this in more detail in the lab, but I'm not going to focus on these openings. I want to introduce them. I want you to know that they're openings. I want you to know generally what they do, which is to transmit nerves, but I'm not going to ask you to memorize these right now. I should have taken them off of red actually, but I didn't. But you've got the optic canal, you've got the foramen rotundum, the foramen ovale, and the foramen spinosum. And so as with all of the other openings, holes and foramina in the skull, these guys are passageways for either nerves, in this case, different cranial nerves, as well as arteries and veins. And you can see that the meningeal, oops, there's a spelling mistake there. That should be meningeal artery goes through the foramen spinosum. So just know that those are there. We'll talk about them in more detail in lab. I do want you to know, I mentioned the superior orbital fissure is right here. So this is obviously a skull from the anterior view, probably recognize that pretty readily. We're looking back through the eye socket, and you can see that anterior fissure right there as part of the sphenoid bone. So this is your lesser wing up here and your greater wing right there, and there's this kind of slit between them. And that's important because a bunch of your cranial nerves pass through there, as well as, the cranial nerves pass through there, and they control the movement of your eyes. So I do want you to know the superior orbital fissure. That's one that I would like you to make sure you know. So we can look at the sphenoid bone from a couple more angles here. This is the posterior view. This is what I showed you before. Note superior orbital fissure here between this lesser and greater wing. I'm going to go back a slide and just show you what that looks like from the anterior view. That's this right here, right? So just make that connection. And then I showed you also, you've got this pterygoid process that's kind of coming down here. If we look at this, if we flip this around and look at it from the top, you can see this sella turcica is right here. That's where your pituitary gland sits. And you can see some of these other foramina here through which those nerves and blood vessels pass. That's all I'm going to say about the sphenoid bone. It's a complicated bugger. You'll see it in lab. It's kind of cool when you look at it. You're like, how the hell does this fit in the skull? And then you'll orient yourself to the sella turcica and then this part of the anterior cranial fossa. And then you'll be like, oh, that's how it fits in the skull. And then you'll put all the other bones in around it. It's fun. It's like a puzzle when you take this guy's apart and put it together. Questions? Still freaking me out to be teaching without a mask on. Not gonna lie. I almost wore one just for like comfort. It was like a security blanket. I'm used to having my face hidden. Now I have to like check and make sure I don't have spinach in my teeth before class and all that. It's gonna be a giant pain. Anyway, I'm just kidding. I do that anyway, even when I have a mask on. I wouldn't come to class with spinach in my teeth. Nor would I eat spinach for breakfast, unless I was having a breakfast burrito with spinach, which is not a bad thing. Let's talk about the ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone is this other funky bone of the cranium. And I'm going to show you here, this is from the anterior view, and you can see parts of it poking through, the nasal opening here, and the orbit of the eye here. It doesn't really do it justice. You just see little bits and pieces of it sticking out. And so what's important to note here is the position. The ethmoid bone is between the sphenoid bone and the nose, and is in the middle. So it forms this medial bony region between the nasal cavity, which is in here, and your two eye sockets. So basically is the bony structure between your eyes and your nose, right? And this guy looks like this. Again, super funky looking bone. It's got this thing sticking up the top. It's got this long, thin flat area down here, and it's got these kind of convoluted structures on the side. And I'm going to walk you through what each of those, well, what the major structures are. The first is this, what's called the crista galli. So this is an attachment point for something called the falx cerebri. You don't need to worry about this right now. We'll get to it later when we talk about the brain again. But it's this tissue that basically anchors the brain to this little process coming on up the superior aspect of the ethmoid bone. So again, this will be important when we get to the brain. But for now, I want you to know what that little pointy part is called, and it's called the crista galli, which, if I'm not mistaken, comes from the word for rooster or chicken. Yeah, it does. Yep, I got it up there. Like gallo in Spanish. I don't forget what rooster is in French. Who knows French? What is it? C-O-Q. Oh yeah, le coq. Yeah, that's right. Okay, nice job pulling that out. Okay, we then have something called the cribriform plate. This forms the roof of your nasal cavities and part of the floor of your anterior cranial fossa. So it's basically like bone between your brain and your nasal cavity. And it's got all of these kind of funky convolutions, which we're not going to get into in a lot of detail. But I want you to know that this structure here forms that barrier between your nasal cavity and your brain above. Let's see. It also has these foramina through which one of your cranial nerves passes. These cranial nerves, I know I'm giving you all these cranial nerve 1, cranial nerve 5, cranial nerve 7. Don't worry about those details right now. I should actually take them off of these slides. We'll get to those when we get to the nervous system. What's nice is just so you can see the connection between where those nerves pass in the bones and then eventually what those nerves do, where they're delivering information to. We then have something appropriately called the ethmoidal labyrinth, which is filled with ethmoidal air cells. So this is like this kind of convoluted structure here. It's got air pockets inside of it. Notice you've got a left one, and of course you've got a right one here. So this is, I don't know if I made this clear, this is an anterior view of the ethmoid bone. So this is looking at it from the front as if you're looking at my ethmoid bone right through my nose right there. And then finally, we have what's called the middle nasal concha. These are, you're going to see that there's 3 nasal conchae. There's a superior, a middle, and an inferior. The superior and the middle are part of the ethmoid bone, and the inferior nasal conchae are their own bones. You'll see that in just a second here when we get to the facial bones. But these guys extend into the nasal cavity, and what's important is they contain this olfactory epithelium. So they contain these specialized cells that allow you to sense smell, right? And that's why they're kind of convoluted, because that provides more surface area for these smells. For these cells, the more surface area there is, the more cells there can be. The more cells there are, the more fine-tuned can be your sense of smell. So ethmoid bone there. I see I've got one more feature here. Coming down the middle here, you've got your perpendicular plate. This forms the superior part of your nasal septum. And so your nasal septum is this division between your left and your right nostrils. And there's 3 parts of your 3 structures that make up the nasal septum. One of them is this perpendicular plate. We'll also see another bone called the vomer, and then the last part of it is cartilage, a lot of cartilage there. So if you have like a deviated septum, or you get punched in the nose and your septum gets deviated, I guess, that can be damaged to, hopefully not to this bone, hopefully to the cartilage or the other bone. If it's damaged to this bone, you could be in trouble. Ethmoid bone, there it is. Boom. Questions? Anybody's favorite bone of the skull, the ethmoid bone? You're like, yes, finally. I've been waiting all semester for this moment. No, you guys are holding out for the vomer, huh? The vomer's awesome because there's really nothing on it. Oh, I forgot something. Oops. I forgot one thing. Sorry about that. So the orbital plate, this is this side of it right here. That contributes to the medial side of the eye orbit. So if I go back just for a second, to the big diagram here, that's going to be like this part of the ethmoid bone right here that forms part of the medial aspect of the orbit of the eye. So you've got this ethmoid bone, all these features. Sorry, I almost forgot the orbital plate. Looks like that. And then I want to show you the ethmoid bone in context on the next slide, but I'll make sure you got these notes. Okay, so let's take a look at this bone in its context. So ignore the bottom for now. I want to show you this top diagram first. It's a little complicated, so I'm going to walk you through it. So this is a skull. This is the facial bones cut in a sagittal plane, right? And it's basically, in this case, right down the middle. And so what you see here are the structures that make up your nasal septum. So I mentioned this is that perpendicular plate of your ethmoid bone is right here from a lateral view. Below that, it articulates with a bone called the vomer, the one we've all been waiting for. We'll look at it in detail in a second. And then all of this is cartilage. So this is the stuff that's in the middle of your nose. It's nice and flexible. You can take your nose and wiggle it a little bit, and you can feel that cartilage move. The bone, not so much. But I want to show you, my point of this slide is to show you this perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone in context. Note that those lateral aspects of the ethmoid bone are not visible here. The one closest to you, the right one, has been removed, and the left one is going to be behind these other bones. You can see here the crystal gallery up at the top there. Jump up, you get it. You can see, remember, that's an important attachment point for a tissue that anchors the brain. Anchors the brain. Now, if we make a parasagittal cut, so this is again a cut in the same plane, but just a little bit off center, so we can see some of the structures. You can see some cool things here. First and foremost, you can see your sphenoid bone here. And remember those pterygoid processes that stick down inferiorly off the body of the sphenoid bone? They look kind of weird and out of context when you see them, but now you can see how they articulate with these other bones of the front, these other facial bones, right? For our ethmoid bone, we can see the superior and middle nasal conchae right here. Those two conchae are part of the ethmoid bone. The inferior nasal conchae, you'll see in a second, is its own bone. And then here, what I want to show you here, these conchae form divisions within the nasal cavity that are called the superior, middle, and inferior meatus. So remember we learned the term meatus when we talked about the skull. We have an example lab of like the ear canal, basically. This is another example. It just means a passageway. And so essentially, your nasal cavity isn't just a big open area. It's this kind of convoluted pathway where air can flow through these different meatuses, which is the plural. And remember, you have this on your right and your left side too. And this performs an important function physiologically. What this does is when you inhale air through the nose, this one, as I mentioned, increases surface area for those olfactory epithelial cells, so it allows you to have more cells to smell with. But importantly, it also performs the function of humidifying air that you breathe in, warming it, and helping to filter it. That way, if you're in an area you're breathing in dust or pollen or anything like that, all that junk, not all of it, but it'll get caught up in the mucous membranes of your nose, and so it won't go into your lungs. Also, gas exchange in your lungs is more efficient. We're not going to get into this part in class, but I'll just tell you, when the air is warmer at body temperature or so, as well as when it's humid, and so air circulating through here helps do all those things, so the air going to your lungs is kind of in a good, a better state to help facilitate that gas exchange. So you've got ethmoid bone here. You can see where it articulates with the sphenoid bone there. Questions? Okay, to put this in even bigger context, we're going to go out. We got a mid-sagittal section through the skull. You can see here some of these bones in context. There's a lot on this diagram. I'm not going to ask you to know all of this. I just like this diagram here because you can see that perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone right here. That's the middle of it, remember? And then you can see also where it articulates with the sphenoid bone. So this is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, remember, forming part of that surface of the anterior cranial fossa. You've got the body of the sphenoid bone here, and you can see how all of those things kind of fit together. And we'll get into some of the other bones there coming up as well. And you can see, of course, the bones of the cranium we've talked about: frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal there. Cool, now you get to draw. All right, go ahead. Give me a lateral view of the skull from memory as best you can and label the following bones. You have 2 minutes. Go. Oh, just kidding. Don't look at that. Try to do it without your notes if you can, as well as you can. If you need to consult the notes after, that's fine. All right, should have drawn a diagram that looks something like this. Go ahead and update your diagram as needed. So you've got your temporal bone, kind of right in the middle here, occipital bone, inferior, posterior region. Parietal bone actually forms most of the cranium, most of the posterior and anterior aspect of the cranium. Frontal bone up here, anterior. A little bit of the sphenoid bone sticking out, and basically, did I ask you to include the ethmoid bone? I don't remember. Yeah, no, because you can't really see it. You can see a little bit of it from that angle, but I do want you to be aware, you've got a little bit of the ethmoid poking through right there. Any questions on that? All right, so that is the bones of the cranium. Next, we're going to talk about the 14 facial bones. So this will round out our discussion of the bones of the skull. There are 14 of those bones, but 5 of them are in pairs. So we have the nasal bones plural, left and right lacrimal bones, left and right zygomatic bone, left and right maxilla, left and right inferior nasal conchae. And then we have left and right palatine bones as well, which you can't see from this aspect. So that's 5 different bones that are paired. And then we have the, wait, did I say that right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Wait a second, why did I count wrong? Nasolacrimal zygomatic maxilla. Oh, I guess because I'm not counting I'm adding the mandible on here. So there's actually 15 altogether if we count the mandible. Okay. And then we've got the vomer, this little guy that forms the posterior part of your nasal septum right there. And then we've got the mandible. So the number is a little bit confusing because I didn't include all the bones, but don't worry about that. We'll walk through all of them in detail. First, I want to talk about the maxillae, or the maxillary bones. These are basically the top bones that form your mouth. You can see where it is in structure right here. They bear your upper jaw, and they have some different processes that we'll talk about moving in different directions. Specifically, there's 4 processes. We have the frontal process, which kind of comes up and forms part of the bridge of your nose. You can see where it looks right here. It forms this kind of posterior part of your nose right there. We have the alveolar process, which contains the sockets for the teeth. We have the zygomatic process. This is cut, but this is the front part of your cheekbone, like right here, just lateral to your nose. In this view, it's cut here. You can't see it very well. And then we have something called the palatine process that I'll show you from a different angle. We kind of can't see it from this angle here. Let's see what I want to take away from here. That's the main thing about the maxillary bone. Remember, they're paired. You have a left and a right, and they contain teeth. So how many bones in your body, pop quiz, contain processes for teeth? You can guess. We haven't covered it all yet. Guess. Close. Not quite two. Three. Yep. What are they?
The mandible.
Mandible.
And this. Oh, well, are there two of these?
Yeah.
So it's these two in the middle.
Yeah. So the bones that contain sockets for teeth, which remember are gum fosses, those immovable joints that are only found with teeth. We have the mandible, which is one big bone down here. And we have your left and your right maxillary bones. So there's 3 bones that contain teeth. Let me see. Okay, so the maxillary bone articulates with basically all of the other facial bones. Actually, it does articulate with all of the other facial bones with the exception of the mandible. So it's considered the keystone bone of the face. It contains sinuses. These are the sinuses just lateral to your nose. Again, ones that get achy when you're sick. In fact, they're the biggest sinuses in that area, the maxillary sinuses. It forms part of the inferior orbital fissure. So we've got, remember, just to orient you, we've got the superior orbital fissure here. Look back in the eye socket, and that is formed between the greater and lesser wing of your sphenoid bone. And we also have this other fissure that's basically formed between this greater wing of the sphenoid bone and part of this maxillary bone. On the previous diagram, I mentioned there was another process that I couldn't show, this palatine process, and you can see that here. This forms the what's called the hard palate, or the roof of your mouth. If you stick your finger up just posterior to your teeth and feel that hard bone there, I'm not going to do it right now, that is going to be this palatine process of your maxillary bones. It forms what's called the hard palate, or the roof of your mouth. And then these guys also contain foramina for some nerves. Again, I'm not going to ask you to know those in details. I just want you to be able to identify them generally and know what their job is. And this guy right here, see, it's a rather large foramen, and through that passes one of your cranial nerves, or one of the branches of cranial nerve 5. So lots of stuff going on with the maxillary bone, bones, plural. I'll say a little bit more about them coming up as they articulate with other bones. But the takeaway here is that it forms parts of a lot of important structures. It forms part of your cheekbone right here. You have the zygomatic process. It contains your teeth with the alveolar processes. It forms part of the hard palate of your mouth with the palatine process. And then it forms part of the bridge of your nose with that frontal process. So I'll go back a slide here and just remind you of those 4 processes that are important in the maxillary bones because they form part of these important structures. So again, frontal process, bridge of the nose, alveolar process, holds your teeth, zygomatic process, the anterior part of your cheekbone, and the palatine process, which I'll show you on this slide. Oops, not that slide, this slide, forms part of that hard palate of the roof of your mouth. That's the takeaway about the maxillary bones, keystone bones of the face. Questions? All right, let's talk more about your cheekbones. I mentioned the anterior part of your cheekbone is formed by the zygomatic process of the maxillary bone. You move posteriorly, there is a joint here. It is a synarthrotic joint, meaning there's no movement. It articulates with bones on either side called your zygomatic bones. So this is kind of academic, but it's important to note something here. The zygomatic process is this whole kind of bridge of bone right here, extending from your temporal bone to your zygomatic bone to your maxillary bones. That whole thing we call the zygomatic process. Part of what makes up that zygomatic process is the zygomatic bone. So I just want to make sure we're clear on this distinction between the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process. And you can see that nicely right here. So it's this more kind of lateral aspect of your cheekbone. You can feel that one really nicely right there. And that's all we're really going to say about the zygomatic bone. There's a lot of bones in the face, but we don't really spend much time with them, to be honest, compared to the cranial bones. The cranial bones have lots of kind of interesting things going on for the most part, except for the parietal bones, which are just big and boring. The facial bones, kind of the same, except for the maxilla and the mandible's kind of interesting too. The nasal bones, just these two little guys that form part of the bridge of the nose. So remember, this frontal process of the maxillary bone comes up right here. And then, just superior to that and anterior are these two little bones called your nasal bones. And that, you can feel them right up here, bridge of your nose. It's hard guys right there. And if you move down kind of anteriorly, you can feel where it transitions to the cartilage pretty readily right there too. It gets softer. It's fun to talk and do that at the same time. A couple other paired small bones there are your lacrimal bones. These guys are just here in the medial aspect of your eye orbit. What's notable about these guys, lacrimal comes from the word for tears, and they have this little fossa, what's called the lacrimal fossa, where your tear ducts sit. And so they are important because without them, you couldn't be sad. Well, you could be sad, you just couldn't show it to other people. Well, there's other ways to show you couldn't cry, I'll just say that. So again, these paired little bones right here, that's all we're gonna say about the lacrimal bones. We've also got palatine bones. These are paired. So I mentioned that this palatine process of your maxillary bone forms the anterior part of your hard palate, the roof of your mouth. The posterior part is formed by this palatine bone. And it's kind of a weird shaped bone. You'll see it in lab, but it kind of has a part that goes up and down, and this is called the perpendicular plate, and then part that goes horizontal, and that's that is called the horizontal plate. Very cleverly, and that forms this very posterior region of your hard palate. Now, if you stick your finger in your mouth and feel right just behind your teeth, you'll feel this hard palate formed by your frontal bone here. You go back a little bit, that continues with this hard palate formed by the palatine bone. You go back even further, back here, you can feel it's soft. There's no bone there. That's called your soft palate. So there's a tissue that forms a barrier between your oral and your nasal cavities here, but there's no bone there, hence the name soft palate. It's kind of awkward. I don't really recommend doing that. I'm just saying if you did. The palatine bone, also this perpendicular plate forms part of the lateral walls of the nasal cavity as well. So it's an important bone for part of the nasal cavity as well as part of the oral cavity there. And that's all we'll say about that guy. Those guys, plural, there's two of them. Next, the moment you've all been waiting for, your favorite bone, the vomer. It's this guy, it's like kind of triangular shape, more or less, maybe like arrow shaped. You can see it up there. What's notable about the vomer is it looks really different depending on where you're looking at it from. So this is from an inferior aspect. So these are your maxillary bones. Actually, this is a great view. I want to show you this. This is important. So this is your two maxillary bones, right? You can see your teeth are in there. That forms the anterior part of that hard palate. The posterior part is formed by these horizontal plates of your palatine bone. And then you've got this little vomer that sits in there really nicely between parts of the sphenoid bone as well. You look at this from the anterior view, looking in your nose, you can see the vomer right there, nice little triangular shaped bone that forms the inferior part of your nasal septum. You can look at it. Actually, no, I thought I had another image on there. You can see what it looks like from a lateral view there. And I think we'll get through the mandible. We probably won't finish the mandible today. The mandible is the big, interesting guy. I'm going to cover one more pair of small bones, the inferior nasal conchae. Remember, I said that there's a superior, a middle, and an inferior nasal concha, right? Conchae, plural. The top two, The superior in the middle are formed by parts of your ethmoid bone. The inferior, the lowest one, is formed by its own bone called the, appropriately enough, inferior nasal condyle. And again, these form those convoluted passageways through which air flows when you inhale through your nose. You can kind of see these guys if you look anteriorly. You kind of see them sticking out right there a little bit through the nasal cavity. Let me just pause there. All right, let's talk about the last facial bone. We whipped through the face pretty quick here, and that is the mandible, or your jawbone. It is the largest bone of the face, the largest facial bone. It's also the only bone of the skull that has a freely movable joint that can move. And it does that right back here. There's condylar joints at which it articulates with your temporal bone. We'll talk about that joint in a little bit. So this is a big old bone, contains your teeth, and it has two main parts. What's called the rami. We talked about these in lab a little bit, and it comes from the word for arm. Ramus is singular, and like many other bones we've seen, it has a large part called the body. There's a few other important features on this guy that I'm going to ask you to know, and this includes the mandibular fossa. So that, well, let me back up for a second. I'll start with the mandibular fossa. This is actually part of your temporal bone. This is the smooth area here at which the condylar process of the jawbone articulates. So this is your temporal mandibular joint, your TMJ. Some of you, hopefully none of you, but some of you may have had problems with this joint, which they just call like TMJ. Chew a lot of gum or other things that can give you trouble. You can feel this joint really nicely here, just anterior to your ear, and just go ahead and clench your jaw, and you can feel that articulation. Open and close your mouth, and you can feel that. It's a very flexible, movable joint, and generally just in one plane, though, although you can move your jaw side to side a little bit. So just to articulate again here, that's the mandibular fossa, your temporal bone, and this condylar process of the mandible articulates there. We then have this mandibular notch, this little dip in the bone, and then we have a part of the bone that sticks up here called the coronoid process. That is where a muscle inserts, specifically this temporalis muscle that's important for closing your jaw. So that's one of the muscles that helps close your jaw. A couple other features. We have this mandibular foramen. This is, again, a hole through which a nerve comes. We have the alveolar processes. This is where the teeth articulate with the bone in those gomphoses, plural. And then we have a foramen here called the mental foramen. Mental refers to chin. I don't know how mental now, it tends to refer more to like the brain. I don't know. I just think of like Ron Weasley saying like, that's mental. But it actually means chin. And so you have a foramina on either side of your chin called the mental foramina. You can just see one here. And that's where blood vessels and nerves, yes, blood vessels and nerves travel to the chin and the lower lip region. So some important processes on the mandible. You should know this diagram for sure. I'm going to talk a little bit more about them coming up. But actually, wow, this is actually the end of this lecture. Let's just finish the facial bones. We got like one more slide. You guys are great. This is great. You did a great job today. You should all feel good about your work in human anatomy today, especially after your long practical yesterday. So just to show you another diagram, I believe I put this one in your study guide as well. This one contains those important parts of the mandible that you should know. Again, this is a synovial joint here, the only synovial joint in your skull. Provides a lot of movement to your jaw, which is kind of constantly moving, at least when you're standing up here lecturing. For you guys, it's not moving as much right now. But important for speech, eating, you know. This is the first time all semester where I had exactly enough lecture slides for the exactly amount of class. I always have like 17 other lecture slides, but today is like spot on. Good job. Questions before we wrap things up? We've got to take it out for you.
Can you go back
Of course. That's nice. This will provide a clean break. We'll start a new unit on the Monday after spring break. That works out well. We'll get to skull in lab. So just a couple of reminders. Here's your, I went to put this at the end, but it's up there now. There's your Venn diagram for Friday. I don't think I've used this one yet, have I? Some of them, okay, yeah, this is a good one. Good way to start your spring break. Happy spring break, everybody. Remember that you have a quiz on Friday. So the quiz will be open all day Friday. It's designed to take about 20 minutes. You'll have 30 minutes. The details are in your class program for today. Specifically, it covers everything on muscles in that one last lecture on joints. Nothing on skull will be on the quiz. We're going to continue all of that after spring break. There is no new class program for Friday or for spring break either. Go do not stuff related to human anatomy for a week, and then we'll come back and get back to it. From my personal philosophy is that it's a break for a reason, and we all need that kind of mental break. Yeah, right. I was trying to think of like a synonym for break. Respite, maybe. I don't know. We need that. So at least from this class, you'll be able to take that unless you're behind on stuff. Otherwise, here's a ticket out for you. I'm just going to ask you to upload your image and answer a couple other kind of challenging questions, but do your best. They're multiple choice. This is just a check for understanding and make sure you're getting what we're talking about in class. Otherwise, I'm going to end the recording here for those of you watching online, and I will stick around to answer any questions. Oh, you know what I'll do right now is open up your grades actually in Blackboard.